Every morning, when the city is still quiet, when the streets are not yet crowded and the sunlight has just barely brushed the rooftops, there's one thing that always makes people feel like a new day is beginning: the smell of coffee. It doesn't have to be a strong espresso or an elegant cold brew. Sometimes just a cheap cup of instant coffee is enough to awaken a familiar feeling: alertness, reassurance, and a quiet sense that the world is still turning the way we once knew it. Coffee isn't just a beverage, it's a ritual, a moment of stillness in the rush of daily life. It's how a doctor prepares mentally for a long shift, how a mother exhales in relief once the kids are off to school, how a retiree flips through the morning paper looking for a bit of news from a world that seems to be changing by the day. But then one day, that seemingly unshakable routine suddenly wavers. You walk into your usual supermarket, head to the same shelf where your go-to coffee used to be, and see the price has shot up, not by a few cents, but by a few dollars, maybe even a quarter of your weekly income. You hold the can of coffee in your hand, torn between keeping it or putting it back. And when you place it back on the shelf, it's not because you no longer want it, it's because you're choosing between coffee and a hot meal, or maybe just a bottle of milk for the child waiting at home. In that moment, you realize a cup of coffee is no longer a given. It becomes a quiet litmus test of where you stand in society, of whether you still hold enough consumer value to keep being served. They say, when the economy shifts, look at the smallest things. And coffee, that tiny, seemingly harmless thing, is now reflecting something much bigger. A transformation is underway, not on financial news tickers, but right on the kitchen counters of everyday families. And to understand where that transformation is coming from, we have to start with the familiar brands, from Folgers to Great Value to La Colombe, to see what's really happening behind those seemingly small numbers printed on the price tags. Let's start with what seems like the simplest thing: price. A can of Folgers Classic Roast, one of the most popular coffee brands in North America, once considered a symbol of affordable pricing, used to cost around $7.99. Now, in many states, that number has jumped to $11.14, even $12.99. For middle-class urban families, that might be a minor annoyance. But for retirees, those living on social welfare, or anyone managing a tight weekly budget, it's a quiet shock. A can of coffee now costs the same as 3 basic breakfasts, or a third of a tank of gas. Great Value, a name that practically screams budget-friendly, was once seen as the last line of defense between low-income consumers and the loss of purchasing power. Yet within a single month, its price jumped from $6.48 to nearly $9. La Colombe, a younger, trendier brand aimed at urban consumers, hasn't escaped the wave either. A box of 4 cans, once priced at $12.99, has now crept up to nearly $18. Consumers are starting to respond, not with outrage, but with a kind of quiet disappointment. Households that once brewed coffee every morning now make smaller batches or water it down. Some have reluctantly switched to tea bags, not out of preference, but because their budgets no longer have room for coffee. No one's announcing that they've quit coffee, but consumer behavior is shifting bit by bit. This is like small cracks forming in the wall of routine. What's strange is this: the price hikes haven't been sporadic. They've happened nearly all at once, across brands, across retail chains. From Walmart to Trader Joe's, from Toronto to Phoenix, the familiar names have all crossed into a new price bracket, as if pushed forward by some invisible hand. There were no warnings. Shoppers only noticed when the weekend bill got longer, and this morning's coffee carried the bitter aftertaste of regret. Is this simply the result of inflation, or is it the early sign of a deeper economic tremor, starting in the last place anyone expected: a can of coffee? As usual, the answer doesn't lie in the store or on the supermarket price tag. It lies in quiet boardrooms in Washington, where policies are shaped by dry technical language, but carry enough weight to affect every single breakfast across the country. Because on August 1st, 2025, the US government activated a new trade policy called Protecting Domestic Production. It sounds like a big picture strategy, but few realize that one of the first industries it would impact was coffee. And from there, a domino effect began, from coffee farms in Vietnam and Brazil to the shelves at Walmart to the ceramic mug in your hand each morning. August 1st, 2025, a date that, at first glance, seems entirely unremarkable. But for those closely following global trade dynamics, it marked the beginning of a quiet yet powerful shift. That's when the US government officially rolled out its new policy, protecting domestic production. A name that sounds vague, even patriotic, but beneath it lies a series of tariff barriers aimed squarely at industries heavily reliant on imports. And one of the first casualties? Coffee. It sounds strange at first. After all, the US isn't exactly known for its coffee production. While coffee is grown in Hawaii and more recently in some tropical pockets of California, domestic output makes up less than 1% of national demand. The vast majority, from low-cost Robusta to premium Arabica beans, comes from developing countries like Vietnam and Brazil. And yet, those very countries are now facing the steepest tariffs, a 50% duty on Robusta coffee from Vietnam, the bean commonly used in instant coffee, and a 35% tariff on Arabica from Brazil, the world's largest supplier. But why? Behind those dry numbers lies a complex game of geopolitics. The US isn't just trying to protect a handful of domestic coffee farmers, it's sending a message to two strategic regions, South America and Southeast Asia. These are areas where China's influence has been steadily growing, through infrastructure projects, investment flows, and deepening political ties. In this context, taxing coffee becomes Washington's way of both reasserting control over the supply chain and applying pressure on countries viewed as key waypoints in Beijing's strategic expansion. But the immediate impact doesn't hit Beijing or Brasilia. It lands directly on American consumers. Everyday coffee brands like Folgers, Maxwell House, and Dunkin', all of which rely heavily on imported beans, now face hard choices: raise prices, cut product lines, or find alternative sources. Either way, the result is the same: coffee is no longer cheap. This has led to subtle but unmistakable changes in supermarkets. More and more shoppers are noticing that the brands they've always bought are no longer in their usual spots. Some disappear altogether. Not because they've stopped selling, but because a new rule is quietly reshaping how products get shelf space: profit per inch. And that's when the supply chain, the once invisible system humming quietly in the background, steps into the spotlight, revealing its brutal logic. Retailers no longer prioritize popularity or brand loyalty. They prioritize profit margins. And when import tariffs drive up the cost of coffee, the product doesn't just become more expensive, it becomes less financially viable in the eyes of the retailer, which is how a can of Nescafe gets pushed to the bottom shelf, how a box of Starbucks Pike Place vanishes from rural store shelves. Not because the people there don't need it, but because they no longer fall within the distributor's strategic profit map. At this point, it's no longer just about tariffs or import costs. It's about selection, about how the modern supply chain is beginning to prioritize speed, margin optimization, and high-value consumers. The question is, if everything is being tailored toward wealthier buyers, then who's left to serve the everyday person, the one who just wants a simple cup of coffee to start their day? In the modern world of retail, where every square foot of shelf space is a silent battleground for profit, a seemingly simple principle is quietly reshaping consumer behavior: profit per shelf inch. That means if a product doesn't generate enough profit, no matter how well it sells, it can be pushed out of prime placement. And coffee, once a supermarket staple, is becoming the latest casualty, not because people have stopped drinking it, but because the new distribution model no longer serves the majority. Products once given prime eye-level spots like Nescafe Classico or Starbucks Pike Place are now quietly relegated to the bottom shelf, the outer edges, or have vanished entirely from rural stores and small-town markets. For people in big cities, this might barely register. They have alternatives, a wide selection of supermarkets and specialty shops. But in remote or rural areas where there's only one local store, when a product disappears from the shelf, it disappears from life. Taking the place of those familiar brands are more premium coffees, designed for affluent urban consumers who are willing to pay more for a name or an experience. These brands, often controlled by multinational corporations, not only bring in higher profit per unit, but also align with the new goal of a cleaner supply chain, one that values speed, traceability, and brand positioning over mass accessibility. The supply chain, once imagined as a system that serves everyone, from rich to poor, from cities to rural towns, is now becoming clearly stratified. Delivery routes, shipping schedules, even the way pricing is calculated, all are being optimized to serve those seen as the highest value customers in the eyes of distributors. This creates a strange asymmetry. While the upper income class now enjoys more variety than ever, from cold brews to organic fair trade blends, working class families, seniors, and households with multiple children are left to navigate fewer choices, higher prices, and lower quality products. These changes don't make headlines. There are no protests, no breaking news alerts. It's just that one day you walk into your usual grocery store and don't see the coffee you always buy. You check another store, and another, and slowly you realize something is changing. Not in you, but in how the market perceives your consumer value. Each small shift, a product's placement, a disappearing brand, a few extra dollars on the price tag, begins to pile up, pressing against the routines of millions of people. And at some point, those who once felt confident they were still in the game will begin to realize they're slowly being left behind, not by their own choices, but by a system that is restructuring its priorities. That's when the story of coffee stops being about taste or preference. It becomes a symbol of something far bigger, that fractures in modern society don't always come from dramatic shocks. Sometimes they begin with something as small as a cup of coffee becoming too expensive to buy. And when even the most familiar thing becomes a luxury, that last drop, the one called coffee, might just be what makes the cup finally overflow. A retiree in Ohio living on a meager $130 a month in social assistance shared, "I can't give up cup coffee, but now I have to measure every spoon. Every time I brew a cup, I think about a hot meal, a prescription, or half a tank of gas." That sentence, simple as it sounds, perfectly captures a feeling that's quietly creeping into the minds of millions across the US and Canada. The sense that what used to be routine, what once felt perfectly normal, is now becoming a harsh equation of survival. When the price of coffee rises by $2, then $3, then $5 a can, it's not just a financial issue, it's an emotional wound. A sign that the system is quietly pushing the poor to the margins, not through legislation, not through verdicts, but through changes so small, few notice them. In working class neighborhoods, where the smell of coffee once drifted from tiny kitchens each morning, there's now a silence. People have started watering it down, switching to cheaper brands, or giving it up altogether. No one protests. No one slams the table demanding the right to drink coffee. But in that silence lies a deep sense of loss, because something that once made people feel alive, made them feel like they could still begin the day on their own terms, is no longer so easily within reach. Supermarket chains don't ask why the regulars have stopped coming. They only see the data: profit margins, consumer segments, and sales velocity. They don't see the elderly woman standing silently at the shelf, picking up and putting down the same familiar can of coffee. They don't see the single father torn between a bag of coffee and a bottle of milk for his child. They don't see the look on a young woman's face as she holds her end-of-month receipt and realizes she had to give up even the simplest things. Once again, coffee isn't the issue. It's a symbol, a name written on a much larger page, one where society is quietly rewriting what it means to be a customer worth serving. Low-income individuals, rural residents, those who fall outside of strategic priority groups, they're being written out of the system's field of vision. Not by open discrimination, but through the absence of choice. They're no longer seen, no longer served, no longer counted. And in a society increasingly stratified by consumption, where the right to choose is quietly withdrawn, the final breaking point doesn't have to come from a dramatic event. It can come from something as small as a morning cup of coffee slipping out of reach. At this point, the question is no longer, why is coffee so expensive? It's, why has something so simple become a luxury? And that question, in its own quiet way, is waking people up, not with caffeine, but with a profound unease about the order they're living in. Because when we look back, we realize coffee was never just coffee. It was proof of peace, that each person had the right to start their day in their own way, without needing the market's permission, without worrying about barcodes or profit margins. But now, even that right is being taken, without warning, without a single clear notice. And that raises a deeper, more urgent question. In a world governed by geopolitics, supply chains, and the pace of profit, can we still hold on to the right to live simply? Coffee has always been something that brings people together, a small ritual that reassures us, no matter how complicated the world gets, we can still begin our day with something simple and familiar. But when a cup of coffee becomes a luxury, the story is no longer just about the beans. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the quiet veins of geopolitics and the spirals of profit that few ever see. Yet everyone feels in the tiniest corners of their budgets. Trade wars between global powers, from Washington to Beijing, from Brussels to Brasilia, no longer stay confined to negotiating tables or abstract GDP charts. They're unfolding right now on the kitchen tables of millions of families. When a new tariff policy is enacted, it doesn't just rattle multinational corporations. It seeps into every small kitchen, into every morning brew. Everything is connected. A tariff adjustment in the US can cause Vietnamese coffee prices to spike, forcing a family in Texas to choose between their morning cup and a full dinner. Coffee is also a story of soft power. Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, these major coffee exporting nations aren't just selling a product. They're exporting a piece of culture, a sense of warmth stitched into the rhythm of daily life. When that flow is choked by protectionist policies or economic rivalry, what's lost isn't just a few dollars on a receipt, it's the human connection made possible through a shared, quiet habit. The irony is this: while global trade strategies claim to be securing production safety, ordinary people are losing their safety in the most basic choices. A morning cup of coffee used to be the thing that made life feel manageable, a small reminder that no matter how hard things got, you could still start fresh. Now it's a test of patience, of endurance, and, at times, a silent reminder that you're being pushed to the edge of the economic game. We can debate policies, whether it's about protecting local farmers or countering China's influence, but no one can deny the profound effect these sweeping decisions have on the everyday lives of individuals. Coffee is just one example, but it's the clearest one, because if even something as small as coffee is no longer easy to come by, then what in this world can still be called simple? Maybe it's time we look at a cup of coffee not just as a beverage, but as a question. A question about the right to live simply, to freely enjoy the little things without being swept up in the harsh currents of politics and commerce. A question about who decides the value of happiness in the morning. Is it us, or the invisible hands of the market and international negotiations? And maybe, when those questions begin to echo, we'll finally see that a cup of coffee was never just a cup of coffee. It was memory. It was safety. It was the belief that no matter how much the world outside may change, we could still keep a small space of peace for ourselves. But if even that is taken away, then we lose more than a habit. We lose a part of our humanity, the part that believes the small things matter and are worth holding on to. For decades, a cup of coffee has been a symbol of clarity, a quiet moment when a person reconnects with themselves before being swept into the rush of a new day. It didn't need to be fancy or expensive, just warm enough, fragrant enough, and familiar enough. But when a can of coffee costs more than a meal, when the brands we've trusted quietly vanish from the shelves, and when people start choosing between a cup of coffee and money for medicine or milk, this is no longer just about consumption. It's an alarm bell, signaling a shift in values. A world where simplicity, stability, and the right to live with small, comforting routines are being slowly taken away, chipped down by the pace of profit, the cold edge of policy, and the invisible hands of the global market. This isn't about losing coffee. It's about losing the sense that we're still being seen, heard, and served as people, not just as lines on a consumer spreadsheet. And when even the simplest things become luxuries, maybe it's time we asked ourselves, are we living in a world that serves human beings, or in one where human beings must adapt to the machinery of the market? If you've ever hesitated with a can of coffee in your hand, if you've ever felt like the choices around you are closing in, if you've ever wondered whether you're being left behind, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't be afraid to speak up, because sometimes even small things like a cup of coffee deserve a voice. And if today's story stirred something in you, subscribe to the channel. Let's keep following the changes shaping our world, not just in political chambers, but in the quiet corners of our own kitchens, where every ordinary day begins.